Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters in the Lord, this is my last speech of the evening, and with the conclusion of this speech, we will have finished 2 nights on this topic, and we have 2 nights to go. Now, I understand that I will be in the affirmative the last 2 nights, Thursday and Friday, and my opponent will be in the negative. So this is my last negative speech, and I understand we've agreed that to abide by certain rules of discussion, one of which is Hedges' rules of honorable discussion. And one of the rules we agreed to abide by is that the last speaker in the negative of the topic is not to bring up any new material or new arguments, because the opposition doesn't have a chance to respond to it. So I'm not going to bring up new arguments in this speech. But we have been discussing Romans 9. I mean, we didn't wait, Bruce, until you brought it up this evening. I asked you a question the first night on Romans 9:16, you know, where I had verse 13 wrong, and I've referred to Romans 9 throughout our discussion, so I'm the one that really introduced at least a verse or two in the chapter, and I did refer in my last speech to the fact that one of the things that's most glaring about your analysis of Romans chapter 9 is, as I said, you take one verse as though, oh, this is not talking about eternal salvation, and yet in the very next verse you'll say, oh, this is talking about eternal salvation. And anyone listening to the discussion, your analysis of that chapter, will see how when it suits you, oh, this verse is talking about eternal salvation. But when it doesn't suit you, you say, well, this isn't talking about eternal salvation. It's God choosing Jacob to be an ancestor of Jesus or something to that effect. And yet, too, I responded to it because you quoted and gave a voice or played the tape of my discussion with Pat Donahue. Well, really, you know, what I said then still holds true now. Now, we're going to get into Romans 9 in our affirmative. And so, really, Bruce, we're going to be talking about Romans 9 for the next 2 nights, and we'll talk about it some this evening. But if we want to talk about me not addressing certain things that you said, I think anybody who listens to the debate thus far knows that you've dropped and not dealt with so much more in this discussion that I brought up than you could accuse me of having not addressed. Now, granted, I said I would get to things in Romans 9 in my second speech, and you're welcome to respond to it the next 2 nights of the debate, because I'm going to get back into it again. So we're not going to exhaust the discussion of Romans 9 now. But, you know, Paul mentions Isaac, doesn't he, in the passage of Romans 9. Have I not been talking about Isaac? And one of the questions I gave you that you really didn't answer, you just quoted a verse of Scripture, said, see this verse, which really didn't answer the question. I asked you, was Isaac a child of promise, conditionally or unconditionally? Now, we're going to talk about Isaac because Paul brings up the case of Isaac. So the case of Isaac, chart number 18. Look at Galatians 4:28 and 29, and I think I've cited this already. Paul says, now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then, he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Now, obviously, Paul thought that Isaac's case of becoming a child of promise, and if we'll look at Romans 9, Bruce, Paul equates being a child of promise with a child of God. Look at the passage in Romans 9, which we'll do in just a minute. Well, it's on the chart here, Romans 9:8. Notice this. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. Do you see how Paul parallels being a child of God with a child of the promise? Now, Bruce, let me ask you, is becoming a child of God dealing with salvation or not? So would you say that part of Romans 9 is dealing with salvation? Is being a child of promise and a child of God dealing with salvation or not? Or is it dealing with something temporal in this life only? So you have a problem with that. As I said, you'll go back and forth. How can you deny that's not talking about salvation? Obviously, Paul applies it to salvation in Galatians 4:28, 29. Now, the oath of promise, which is in Romans 9, and I quoted this verse already. So I've already introduced Romans 9. Paul says, this is the word of promise to Abraham and to Sarah. At this time next year I will come and Sarah shall have a son. What kind of son, Paul? A child of promise. See? A child of God. That's the kind of son you're going to have. And notice, that Isaac is going to have his existence and become a child of God and a child of promise because of God's visitation and God's promise. The oath of promise. Give me chart 25 on the seed of Abraham, which is mentioned in the Galatians passage, Galatians 3 and 4, and in the Romans 9 passage. Well, we know that by the term seed of Abraham, it's used in various senses in the Scriptures. Sometimes it refers to the physical seed, or fleshly seed, we might say. Ishmael was, like Esau, in a literal sense, the seed of Abraham, a descendant. Yet, in a higher sense, they were not the seed of Abraham, as Paul shows in not only Romans 9, but in Galatians. These were not, by God, labeled, called, or named, or designated as such. They weren't recognized by God as being child of God, child of promise. Secondly, of course, we realize that sometimes seed of Abraham refers to Jesus Christ specifically. Passage on that. Galatians 3:16. Now to Abraham and to his seed were the promises made. He saith not unto seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed which is Christ. So there he says, look, this is singular in the Old Testament, Paul says, referring to one specific individual. So already we see in Scripture how seed of Abraham can refer to the literal seed, literal descendants according to the flesh of Abraham, can refer to Jesus Christ, and thirdly, it can refer to saved people, God's elect. And we see that in Galatians 3:29. Paul says, if you be Christ, then are you Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Now, chart number 19, Brother Basil. Why, this is questions for the audience, for my opponent, why was Isaac the object of God's choice and promise? Well, again, I've asked him that, really, in the questions, was Isaac a child of promise conditionally or unconditionally? Which is similar to the question, why was Naaman chosen by God for healing when the others weren't? He never addressed that. He kind of dropped that, didn't he? Why was Isaac the object of God's choice and promise? Why was was Isaac's election by God conditional or unconditional? When did Isaac become the child of promise, child of God, or chosen one? And fourthly, was Isaac's supernatural birth the cause of his being elect or the sure result of it? As it was with Isaac, says Paul, so it is with every Christian. Isaac's supernatural physical birth is a type or illustration of the Christian's new spiritual birth. Before any sinner can be born again, God has to work a miracle, just as He did in the case of Isaac. Make no mistake on this point, regeneration, as I've already proven in charts that Bruce has not addressed, regeneration is the direct result of election and the supernatural operation of God. Isaac and Isaiah, two individuals chosen to become the children of God and heirs to the promises of grace and salvation, were, according to the Scriptures, formed from the womb to be God's servant. That was on one of the charts that he never addressed. God said of Isaiah, I have formed you from the womb to become my servant. They were chosen individuals from eternity, from the time of their birth, and so before they were actually saved later in time. Now, give me chart number 20. Talking about Isaac now, because he's in Romans 9. God chose Isaac over Ishmael to be a child of God, a child of promise. But yet, now that's not salvation now. But Paul says, as it was with Isaac, so it is with every other saved person. Well, let's look how it was with Isaac. And what we're dealing with here is type